Hey everyone, welcome to week 8 of American Lit 2. If you hear some kids in the background, my son is playing Pokemon, and my daughter, I'm sure, is chiming in the background about what he should and should not catch. Okay, so for week 8, we're exploring our third installment of The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. So for this week, what Baldwin is going to do, he's going to primarily turn from his experiences with the Christian church of his upbringing to the Nation of Islam. And this is important, especially as we understand the development of the civil rights movement and the rise of the Black Panthers, also kind of the notoriety of Malcolm X. And it's important to understand here that Baldwin has a very nuanced perspective on the subject. So we see at the conclusion of our first installment of this, or I guess it's really our first installment of the second essay, that Baldwin and his relationship with faith is starting to kind of unspool a little bit. So historically, he's been an extremely religious person, but now because of the oppression he has seen from the Christian church, he is starting to kind of backtrack on his faith there. Now, when it comes to the Nation of Islam, Baldwin understands and sees why there's so much of an attraction to it, because the Nation of Islam has offered African Americans the idea of a theology in which to give African Americans hope and liberation in their current situation during the 1960s. And this idea is essentially that white people are these little devils that have oppressed people of color, and that there will be redemption, and essentially these little devils will be overthrown. Now, for a lot of us, that might seem like a wild idea that we've never heard before. And I want to encourage you, as you're reading this, to understand that you're reading this several decades removed from the particular situation that Baldwin is writing into. Now, I think it's also important to understand that while Baldwin acknowledges that this particular idea that gives hope and liberation for African Americans can be valuable, he also sees it as something that is faulty, much in the way that the Christian church at the time was proposing that Africans were descendants of the people of Ham. So for those of you who might not be familiar with this story, Ham is kind of like the cursed child of Noah in the Bible, and essentially all the people from Ham's lineage are destined for an ill fate. And there was this idea that essentially people with darker skin tones were the descendants of Ham and destined for slavery. So this is an actual idea that was taught and that is still prevalent in some areas today. Just a grotesque, awful idea. And Baldwin kind of associates that with what the Nation of Islam is teaching along these lines. But it's very different because it gives African Americans that sense of hope and liberation. And as we're learning about these ideas and learning about the Black Panthers and their means of resistance to the racism during the 1960s, and we can get a better understanding of Malcolm X. And this is kind of like where we're going to focus this week in terms of what we're reading and how we're writing about it, is the tension between these different dynamics of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, specifically in the ways we were taught when we were kids. So when we were kids growing up in school, depending on where you went to school, my education taught it in a very simplistic way. So it was Martin Luther King Jr. was a peace-loving person, and he wanted everyone to get along, right? And that was his tool to overcome racism, and essentially it worked, right? This was like what was taught to me in school. Malcolm X had a different idea. Essentially, he wanted a violent approach to the situation, and it didn't work, right? And so these are two very intense oversimplifications of what happened and what has kind of unraveled from the teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. So I want you to reflect back on what was taught to you about MLK and Malcolm X, if anything at all, right? So I think a lot of us had no education over Malcolm X because it's a completely different perspective than what we were taught. So hopefully through the readings, as well as these extra resources that I'm giving you and the documentary that you've watched, we can understand that in many ways we've been given an oversimplification of these monumental figures of the civil rights movement. And that's what we'll reflect on, right? So if you look here, you'll notice that you've got your reading, and also there's a great interview by Terry Gross, she hosts Fresh Air on NPR, and she's interviewing this author who wrote this book about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And hopefully this will continue to kind of unravel these oversimplified ideas that we had about these two figures. But your assignment is very similar in some ways, right? So you're still going to tease out what the argument is that Baldwin is making specifically about the Nation of Islam and how it's appealing to African Americans. What's going on there? And then how do Baldwin's experiences help us understand what it means to be American? And that's really important, right? Just as we've said every week, that the American experience is very vast. It's very diverse. So even as you're reading these things, you might completely disagree with these arguments, but try to put yourself in Baldwin's shoes. So me, for example, as someone who grew up in Texas, I am now in my 30s and I am a white male in 2022. I think it's safe to say that I have lived a very different life and experienced very different things than James Baldwin. That is going to account for my beliefs and ideas, right? As someone who did not experience racism in the 1960s, I'm going to have different ideas than someone who did. So it's important to understand. Even if you vehemently disagree with any ideas that you encounter, understand that those ideas and reasons and beliefs are there for a reason, right? That's so important for us to take account of. Anyway, and then lastly, consider your own identity, your own cultures, your own beliefs, where you grew up, your ethnicity, the church you went to, the neighborhood that you were raised in. Consider what you were taught about the history and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, if any at all. Does Baldwin's representation of these civil rights giants differ from what you were taught? And if so, how? And explore those ideas. What does that mean? Have you felt a little uncomfortable in seeing Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X in a particular light and these kind of retellings of the civil rights movement? And as something that I've encountered a lot in terms of students that have reflected on these ideas, as well as myself, that our upbringing kind of glanced over the civil rights movement. So essentially, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech. The Civil Rights Act passes and racism is defeated, right? This is kind of, obviously the completely oversimplified narrative that we have been given, and we're starting to kind of deconstruct now. So reflect on those ideas, right? How has this been taught to you, and how are these ideas clashing, these different experiences clashing with the things that you were taught? Maybe they don't clash. Maybe they're in complete alignment with what you have learned and have been taught as well. And that is something that you can reflect on. Okay, so that is pretty much what is happening this week. So if you have any questions, concerns, hopes, dreams, aspirations, feel free to contact me. And I would love to assist you in any way I can. Have a great week.